Welcome to the tutorial video on using React. In this video, I'm going to talk about states. The concept of states in React is incredibly important. It allows individual components to remember and act on information. That is, each component has its own state, and depending on what's going on with that component, it can take in information, react to that information, and even pass information to other components. So it becomes incredibly important as we deal with more interactivity to think of things as having different states. So let's look through the code and think about the previous video. In the previous video in this series, I talked about how we were working with modules. We divided up what was a single file into multiple files, each representing their own objects. This allows us to, as I covered in the previous video, make our work more efficient. We can divide up those files into our own objects, so the files represent objects. As we're working with those objects, we can change code in just one location instead of needing to change code in multiple locations or even continuously add to a single file. It is much more efficient to have more files, but have those files represent the objects in which we're working with them. So let's step back through this code again, and then we'll start to think about states when I get to that. So as I reviewed in the previous video, we cut up this file into multiple files. The first of which is now this is importing shopping list from shoppinglist.js. The very first thing is happening within React is always that render function. So we're rendering shopping list as an element, and we know it's an object representing that element. So this is importing shopping list, and we're moving from index.js to shoppinglist.js. This looks exactly the same as it has across the previous two videos in this series. The first thing we're doing is importing React, then we're importing item because we know we use item within this file, and at the bottom we're exporting. And I talked about all of this in the previous video as we talked through different ways of organizing modules, files, and objects. So, as a reminder, right here within its render function, it is returning an unordered list. An unordered list in three cases here is using JSX to interpolate values. In each case, it is calling this.createItem. CreateItem is a function within this object. And in each case, it is passing it a single argument. The value 1, the value 2, and the value 3, lines 15, 16, and 17. Up here within createItem, which is a function within this object, it is returning its own stuff, and in this case, it's returning the element item, and whatever is passed to it as a parameter, it is also supplying as a property, as an attribute, to the element item. So when items render gets called, whatever is passed into it as an attribute will be part of the this.props object. So we're passing 1, 2, and 3 into createItem, which is then a property within that element when it gets created. So we moved from index.js to shoppinglist.js. Now we're going to move over to item.js in order. Item.js is where the new changes come into play. So I mentioned at the start of this video, when we're dealing with states in React, we're dealing with retaining information, retaining statehood, or the state information. To do that, we need to create a state object and then give it any initial values we want it to have. So in which case, if we're dealing with initial values when things are first created, we're dealing with a constructor function. And we see that right here within item. We see now it now has a constructor function, and it's being passed props. Props, as we remember, is the properties, that is, the properties of whatever element it was created with. So we want to make sure we retain those. So the very first thing is happening is it being passed props, then we're calling super and passing in the same argument. The reason we're doing this is because it is a React component, so it also needs that information. So for its parent, what is inheriting from React component, we pass it props as well. So everything has the same information. Then we're creating, setting that is, a this.state object within our item. Notice this.state is equal to an object. it has a single value right now, isDone, which is set to false. And this will be used as part of the information we track within this component. Again, states are important within React because they help us track information and then do something with that information, react to it, if you pardon the pun. So we're keeping track now of isDone. So this.state.isDone currently is equal to false. So let's come down and look at its render function. So when it was first created, the constructor was called. This.props was saved because it was passed into as a part of the constructor, then passed to its super, so React component has it. Then we created this.state with an initial value within this of isDone with its initial value set to false. So finally, coming down to this render function. The first thing that's happening was saying let item, so creating just an empty variable we're going to use momentarily. Then we're doing some conditional checking. This is why states are particularly important. I keep talking about this. This allows components within React to keep information and then do something with that information. In this case, because we now have information we can react on, we can use it conditionally to show different things depending on what's happening. So, notice we're saying this.state.isDone, which we just set within a constructor, is true, and it's not the first time, then item is equal to checkmark. And we're, of course, importing checkmark right here in line 2. So if this is true, we're going to show checkmark. If it's not true, else, which it will not be on the first time, we're instead showing something else. We're instead showing an import element, and then we're using this.props to populate it. So we're showing an import of a type checkbox. We're setting its name to this.props.number, which we know is passed from shopping list when item was called within that and passed into this, and that's why this constructor props and super props are incredibly important. We need to make sure we retain that information. So down here, its name will be set to this.props.number, whatever was passed into that. Then we're doing something a little bit different here. We're setting an event handler, and I'm going to talk about this more in a future video. But for currently right now, we're saying it's on click, so when this is clicked, what should happen is, and we're using an arrow function, which is part of JavaScript ES6. So instead of writing an anonymous function, we're simply writing an arrow function, for we're not passing anything into it. This is the arrow part of this. And we're saying this.setState, and then what should be changed? Its state should be changed to isDone is equal to true. This is incredibly important right here. We could change the value directly by saying this.state.isDone is equal to something else. But the component would not be refreshed if we did that. It is incredibly important when we're working with React and working with states to use the setState function. The reason for this is not only will it change the state value, but it will refresh the component when that happens. This is important because notice this conditional was set within the render function. So it's getting checked every time this is rendered. If we change this value from what it is now to a different value, it will change what it's shown. So this is why setState is incredibly important. We always use setState when we want to change the state information within a component. So finally, coming back to this, if we click on this, this.setState will be called, the state will be changed to isDone is now equal to true, it will be refreshed, and render will rerun. Coming down here, we see finally we're returning a line item with item, the variable, which is either equal to checkmark or is equal to this input right here, that is. And it says to do after this, and is a full line item, which we see over here on the right-hand side. So when we first got to this, this.state.isDone was set equal to false. Coming down here in the conditional, we triggered the else statement, and it showed us an import checkbox, which we see right here. So if I click this, notice it got replaced. setState was called as part of the onClick event handler. Its state was changed is done was set to true, render was rerun, which is why we always use set state to do that. Is done was now equal to true, and so it did this check mark instead of this input. Again, this is why states are incredibly important within React. We can keep track of information within a component, which was then shown as part of this down here. So to do was switched to a check mark. And I'll jump over to check mark real quick, but it's the same as we saw in a previous video. I updated a little bit. Instead of using a variable, we're now using an object just so everything matches across here. In the previous video, I talked about how you could use an object and you can export it the same way as we were using these other objects, but it's easier to think of this as just another React component, so I switched it over to that. Notice it is a class. Checkmark, it also extends React component, and it returns the same thing we saw in the previous video, which is to say a span element with some emoji right here as the checkmark we want. But the most important thing in this video, and as a review of its concepts, is that we use states within React to keep track of information, to react to information, and then to re-render something, show a component again, refresh that component if any of its state information has changed. So this allows us to not only break up things, as we saw in the previous video, break up project into different components, but those own components can keep track of their own information and change and refresh accordingly. And this allows us a greater complexity of using React to break up a project into all of these different parts, have the parts keep track of their own information, and then have them change and refresh according to whatever interactivity or other events or information is handled to them or sent to them, or in some way allow them to change different things. So let's review a little bit how states worked one more time before I end this video. Within item, because we need to initially set up values, we're using a constructor function. We also need to remember that we need that props information. So we're passing props into this, immediately calling super.props to make sure the React component parent class also has the exact same information. Next, and this was a pretty important step here, we're creating an initial value for this .state. We're setting this .state to an empty object, but in our, right here, line 10, we're saying isDone is equal to false. So this .state.isDone, and we have an initial value, and that's our state information we're keeping track of within item. And then we remember down here within the render function that we checked that right here using conditional. Depending on what that value was, it showed different things each time it was refreshed. If isDone was equal to true, we showed a check mark. Otherwise, or else, we showed an input element that was a checkbox, and allows us to now interact with these using an on-click and an arrow function. The most important part of this was using that setState function. This .setState. And as I talked about, anytime we change state information, we want to refresh and we want to use that. This .setState is in fact part of a React component right here, and because this extends that, it also gets that function. So anytime we're changing state information within React, we want to use that setState function, so it will change the state and refresh the component. Incredibly important information right there. But depending on what the state information was, we either showed checkmark or we showed this input, and then we returned whatever that was each time it reran this function. And that allows us some interactivity right here. So we can refresh, and we can shift this depending on the state of item. Allows us to interact with that and keep track of that information, which is how states work within React, as I said multiple times in this video. Thanks for watching.